When you think of game publishers that have made it past the 20-year mark, you're probably not thinking of companies like Qubic Games, but their existence and success over a multi-decade period is a reminder of just how much of our industry is driven by mobile. Despite the fact that 80% of their games look like they exist to bolster Family Guy clips, the numbers do not lie. A lot of these games have seen millions of installs, and now that they're getting bundled and released on Steam, I figured it's a good time to see what makes them tick, and if any of them are any fun. We've got 20 games that I've played for at least 20 minutes each, and I randomly started with Bucket Crusher, a game that introduces us to some of the concepts we'll see recurring in future titles. Simple ideas, simple gestures, and simple progression systems are the three-legged stool upon which most of these are built. And in Bucket Crusher, that idea is wall destruction, that gesture is scooping the debris into your bucket, and that progression is the increasing size, strength, and rotation speed of your saw blade. As you progress through the levels, you'll get different brick-built objects on the right-hand side that you need to destroy, then funnel the resources gained from that destruction into power-ups. It's one of many commerce games on our list, where it's just a theme and a gesture tied to resource acquisition and the upgrading of that resource acquisition. And it's compelling. Limited fuel means you can only destroy in small spurts, and after your fuel runs out, you get brought to a shopping phase where you can pick which unlocks you want. The quick alternation between upgrading phases and destruction phases gives the progression a snappy pace. And if you feel like your progression is starting to plateau, then you could do a prestige on your unlocks to go back to level 1, but bring some permanent unlocks back with you, like a treadmill that helps route bricks into your bucket automatically. The developers must have really liked the Xbox 360, because in addition to that Call of Duty inspiration on your prestige unlocks, there's also a Gears of War influence through a weird active reload that lets you extend your fuel capacity every turn. It's a weird hodgepodge of a game, but its core works, and I was bummed to pull myself away from this one after 20 minutes. I can't say the same about ASMR slicing. The name gives it away. This one epitomizes an almost digital fidget spinner vibe that's present in a lot of this bundle, where it's not designed around a gameplay idea as much as it is a feeling. You play as one of many slicing tools that exist to cut through these sandy, clay-like objects that pass their way on a conveyor belt. Slice more objects and unlock more slicing tools, all of which are functionally the same but can come with their own sound effects. What little game does exist here comes in the form of WarioWare-like instructions that set off each slice. Sometimes you'll start a level and be asked to shave off a certain weight. Sometimes you'll have to slice in a particular spot, and sometimes you'll need to slice at a particular time to get your object to land on a plate below. It's really not enough variety to stimulate, so it's relying heavily on that ASMR-style satisfaction of the feeling of that slice. And honestly, that isn't doing a lot for me because the sound design is just way too harsh for that. Everything sounds crunchier than it looks, and it causes this dissonance between what you're seeing and what you're hearing. To me, it's a relative low point of the bundle, but review quantity seems to suggest I'm in the minority. Slicing games are practically their own genre on the App Store, and this is one of the more popular ones. I think I'm okay with just not getting it. In Infantry Attack, you interface with everything via shooting. You kill your enemies by shooting them, you collect power-ups by shooting them, and you also defend yourself through shooting because the most powerful incoming attacks are projectiles that can be shot out of the air. You get a linear Candy Crush-like progression where you go through a seemingly infinite path of levels to do that shooting in, then take currency into buying new equipment, upgrading that equipment, and also getting additional infantry to shoot alongside you. It's another commerce game despite the overtly action tone. The shooting itself is easy and weighed pretty heavily in your favor. I went 30 minutes before I took my first damage point. If you're paying attention to those unlocks and holding right trigger properly, you'll find yourself trending positively on all those progression systems. The whole thing does feel kind of weird because I'm not sure if infantry was the right fit for the enemy theme. Aside from a few bosses, the rank and file behave more like zombies. Highly rigid movement, and they're choosing to run all the way up to you to melee range is especially weird. And once you realize they're all basically at the exact same height, you can just farm them by holding your cursor just above shoulder altitude and getting those free headshots. You have to work a little harder for your kills in the Nom, the part revenge fantasy, part superpower progression game. You play as an off-brand prey mimic who can, quote, sip the life out of his opponents with the A button. You need to get to the end of a series of hallways, avoid detection from the guys who are looking for you, and sneak up behind them to take their life, or even participate in a little body snatching if the situation calls for it. The appeal here is the movement of your character. You just pick your direction and the limbs will goopily slither where they need to go. It makes you feel powerful and unconstrained. Even the boundaries of the level can be skirted a little bit, which is a nice touch. An out-of-place base building component feels like it hurts the simplicity of this one a bit, but the progression fantasy does feel nice for what it is. Golf Guys is a standout inclusion on this list, and that's probably because it directly seeks inspiration from outside of the mobile sphere. It's Fall Guys meets novelty golf, with fast-paced 3-round eliminations, and enough of a player base that matchmaking gets you into the next game in seconds. Accuracy tests, races to the hole, and golf-themed obstacle courses are the bread and butter that make up Golf Guys' minigames, and they're all great and utilize the same simple swinging control scheme of aiming your shot then defining its power. Having the visual of seeing your competition fail to make the hole, then you put one right in to make it to the next round in their stead, is just so juicy. The biggest tell that this isn't a regular old premium PC game, aside from the graphics, is a meta unlock system that increases the accuracy and power of your shots via booster pack acquisition. But aside from that, Golf Guys is one of the better Fall Guys clones thanks to its lightning fast rounds and the intuitiveness that comes from tying all of its games to golf. Astro Miner is another commerce game, but the big difference here is how it's visualized. This time our resource collection and resource upgrading loop takes place in space, and it's also pushed to cartoonish extremes. When you use your vacuum to suck up minerals, they don't just go to an inventory, but get loaded into your backpack into impossibly high stacks that exit the screen, which you can then turn in for impossibly high stacks of money that exit the screen. The upgrades you can cash those stacks in for feel great. Higher strength vacuuming lets you clear your way to minerals faster, as well as even bigger backpacks for longer hauls. Part of the strategy and optimization here comes from consumable power-ups and how they can synergize. Temporary unlimited backspace and temporary max strength vacuum are both good on their own, but exponentially better together, giving you these moments where you can collect 90% of a planet's resources in like 30 seconds if you time it right. It gives Astro Miner this great feeling of flow and surges of power, rather than just linearly cracking away little by little. You can also start to delegate some of that acquisition out to workers and machines. It's a fun progression game, but not as timeless as something like Helix Jump. This arcadey platformer is built around a simple premise. Not too dissimilar from Super Monkey Ball, you rotate the world around a stationary object to navigate it to the finish line. In this case, though, that world is a corkscrew, and that finish line is at the bottom. The verticality is important because the ball we're trying to navigate can gain momentum from dropping multiple floors simultaneously without getting hit, which both acts as a nice score multiplier, but also a safety blanket because high speeds let you burst through a single hazard. There's this built-in risk-reward from trying to be deliberate with your bounces and descending one floor at a time, but also trying to gain speed where you can. Each level also gives you an extra bonus opportunity for more points at the bottom, where dodging additional floors after the finish line can give you even more points. It's notable that Helix Jump is one of the only games on our list that doesn't have some sort of meta progression layer. Your cross-run currency just exists for cosmetics and extra retries. You could easily imagine this one being in a real arcade cabinet if it got a makeover. The gameplay in Johnny Trigger isn't quite as interesting, but what he lacks in gameplay fundies he makes up for in style. Partially because there's a he at all. Johnny Trigger is the only named character game within the bundle because there's an attempt at an actual story here. A pretty decent one, actually. Textless comic strips are the perfect medium to show us how cool Johnny is, and just how young he was when he first donned his signature glasses. Unlocking those comic strips demands you play an autorunner where you time the shooting of your bullets. The challenge comes from the fact that Johnny is a show-off. He doesn't just walk his way through these levels, he runs, vaults, and unnecessarily flips his way through the levels, demanding you pay attention to his red dot sight and pull the trigger at just the right time. At all levels, it's basically just one big timing minigame with a movie playing in the background, though later levels do introduce hostages you need to avoid, and Rube Goldberg machines of death to attack that mix things up slightly. But the upside of being just a timing minigame with some set dressing is that set dressing is good. Johnny Trigger is a funny game built around a teen boy fantasy of bullet timing and looking cool while doing it. It's on the exact opposite end of the spectrum as Johnny Trigger's Sniper, which does have some fun sniping levels and satisfying gunshots, but lacks a lot of the character that made Johnny Trigger interesting in the first place. Being a sniper puts us in the first person, and right off the bat we're losing half the appeal. First person robs us of the ability to see Johnny do any of the cool matrix flips that defined him in his debut outing, and it also prevents the cosmetic progression angle from feeling meaningful. Why would I care about a new gun skin when I see it for half a second just before and just after scoping? But the non-cosmetic progression feels a little deflating too. Headshots can one-shot everything aside from bosses from the first level, so putting resources into bonus damage is just not as exciting as it would be in their games. Couple that with a major quantity versus quality problem in the levels that all feel the same, and a recurring bug that kept making my cursor pop up on screen despite using a controller, I just didn't love this one. But by pure happenstance, I was able to palate cleanse with the best game in the bundle. I'd never heard of Paper IO 2, and it took me a few tries to really get it, but this is the one that has the most depth, and the most fun if you get into it. It may not look it, but Paper IO 2 is a game of territorial expansion and border security, which is why the fact that all of our canvases are countries is a great fit. It's Snake meets Splatoon, where you have a little character with a trail, and you want to fill in as much of the land as you can. The twist is twofold. Your tail can be hit by other players to knock you out, and when you return back to your colored territory, then your tail locks in and just becomes part of your area. It's a game of tactical risk. You can draw big, long paths, but the further you go and the longer you draw, the longer your tail is, and thus the more open to attack you are. The real skill comes from looking at the map and recognizing when you can take those risks. If you've got the edge of the map to yourself, you can safely expand and fill it in, knowing that nobody can hit your flank. But if you're out in no man's land, you'll want to find a corner or edge to stake your claim first. The default camera angle is zoomed in, so you can't really see that far, and makes drawing long paths even more dangerous because you can't see where your opponents may be coming from. I'm going to keep this one installed and see if I could talk some friends into some matches when it goes live. It's a really great game. So is Hole IO, to a lesser extent. It's competitive multiplayer Donut County. You're a hole, and you can expand your size by eating things. The bigger you are, the more things you can eat, which fulfills this really intuitive power fantasy of being literally the biggest guy in the lobby. Enemy holes can also be eaten, so there's this real snowball effect once you get big. The big get bigger is part of the point, and maybe the only awkward part about that in a competitive multiplayer setting is the fact that the winner is typically going to be decided pretty early on. Once you get someone who is gobbling up everyone else, then you hit critical mass pretty fast and then go to the moon. This one is a lot of fun, if a little sullied by some meta progression. Look, I get why these mobile games all feature bars that need to go up, but getting a larger default hole size is just crazy broken because of the exponential relationship hole size has with growth. It feels unfair when you don't have it, and cheap when you do. Mob Control is like one of those mobile game ads where they play it super bad on purpose to make you rage. Repeatedly fire dudes out of a cannon, line up that firing to gates that multiply the dudes you shoot them out of, and kill your opponent's base before they can kill yours. It's got the same sort of upgrade and progression architecture you'd expect out of one of these things, and I also think it's just another one that I'm not really getting. The shooting feels really indirect because you fire people who swing at things, so you don't get that tactical oomph of a real cannon fire, and the actual game is just kind of lame. Fire at whichever the greatest multiplier gate is, and you'll beat the challenges the early game has for you. Maybe it turns on at some point past where I gave it up, but I think I'll move on to light it up. This is another linear level scrolling game where you defeat seemingly infinite harder challenges, but this one's a platformer. Specifically a platformer with a movement gimmick. You can only jump like a frog. You get fixed hops to the left or right, and a double jump. That's it. If you want to move an inch to the left, you'll have to make a long jump to the left, then a short correction right. Or a long jump to the right and a short correction left. The goal is to jump onto every one of the shapes floating around the given space, and they're laid out in a way that you can't just go in one direction, you'll need to master every angle. It's also one of the only pretty games in the bundle, partially because it recognizes its own limitations, and goes for a simple but cohesive stick figure look with lots of bright colors and calming music. The little sound and explosion of color the shapes make when you first land on them is both a nice visual flourish, but also a practical way to keep track of what you have and haven't done yet in a given level, making it really easy to understand how to play just by looking at it. So is Pocket Mini Golf. You've got simple putting greens, a hole, and a ball. The game really speaks for itself. There's not a whole lot to say. You've got low stakes cozy music going on in the background, an option for a casual mode where you don't need to worry about ball limits, and fast transitions from hole to hole that happen automatically once you get your ball in the hole. It's a simple game that glows so much more when you stack it against its sequel. It's so weird how much worse Pocket Mini Golf 2 is compared to its predecessor. The first isn't some classic masterpiece, but it's not filled with unforced errors like this one is. We get a cool step up in themes and backgrounds, but the actual gameplay suffers tremendously. Every shot remembers the strength and direction of your previous shot, so you have to spend half a second at the start of every swing, basically undoing the preferences of your previous swing. That uninterrupted transition we had previously from level to level now has an animation, an input, and some applause associated with it. Might not sound like a big deal, but when some of these levels are like 5 seconds long, having 5 seconds of transition can really kill that pacing. If this was just a copy-paste of the first game with some more levels and more backgrounds, it would be way better. Instead, we get a playable reminder that games are defined just as much by what they don't have as much as what they do. Aquarium Land is Astro Miner again. This time you play as an aquarium manager. More of a pet store, really. You go get fish from the ocean, bring them back, and put them into the tanks. Then clients will come into the store to buy them, funnel that cash into higher fish capacity and more tanks and workers, and yeah, I think you get the formula on how these ones work. The theme does change a lot of the vibe though. Despite the fact that there's no time limits, you do feel more urgency here when there's customers waiting in line in order to check out. There's not much to say beyond that. It's the same core systems applied to a new aesthetic. So is Dig Deep, actually, but it ties those systems to a much more compelling visual gimmick. Dig infinitely into the ground. You'll start on the surface, you end far below the surface. Or at least that's where I ended. I don't know if there is an end. You have to alternate between digging your hole and getting yourself back up to town to sell. I got to the point where my ladder was so long and climbing it was so slow, I got an elevator. But then that elevator started to become too slow too. The lengthening of that return trip is a reminder of the progress that you're making, and you can occasionally get updates telling you which monuments can fit into the heights of your hole. Once you've had your fill, Dig Deep offers the progression of just digging another one. Amaze is just like if you took those Pokemon Ice Gym sliding puzzles and made them into a full video game. You need to fill out the entire area in paint, and the difficulty comes from the fact that you slide endlessly in your chosen direction until you hit a wall. This one feels great. The ball is really springy, the paint has this nice sloshy sound effect as you hit the wall, and if you're playing on controller, you get a subtle controller vibrate too. There's no time or turn limits. You can just vibe out in paint to increasingly more intricate levels and maze designs. You cannot just vibe out in Run Sausage Run. This is an autorunner where you're always running into danger. Stomping feet and burning coals can kill you in one shot, and you can't control whether or not you run forward, just how quickly you run forward. You're always alternating between a state of running and a state of walking, so the ever-burning question is, do I have enough time to run past this obstacle, but also, do I have enough time to slow down in front of this obstacle? It's a game of precise timing, and it's harder than it looks. The Sausage does a really goofy sprint animation where he goes horizontal and flails his arms about when he runs, which isn't just a visual gimmick, but also impacts his height for the purposes of collectible gathering and obstacle dodging. You've got your usual cross-run currency, which feeds into power-ups, retries, and cosmetics, so feel free to stick him into an S&M suit if you want. Or you can force him to fight in Sausage Wars. This game is one of the hardest to control. You have to knock enemies off of the platform or into sharp objects, but the way you do that is with a whip of your head, which you can only get from a quick jolt backwards then forwards real fast. It's hard to explain, but it basically demands you inverting your movement for a second before crashing forward. But once you get the hang of it, it's kind of fun. It's a last man standing scenario, but encourages you to aggress because getting kills makes you bigger, which makes it easier to get more kills. It's pretty good.